I cannot believe it is time to terminate this buckwheat already. The garden is just buzzing. I don't know if you can hear it, if the camera picks it up, but I mean, it is just full of bees here. They're going to be so sad. Hopefully they will just realize that they have to move on and pollinate the things growing inside the fence. But I'm surprised at how much it just really pains me to be cutting down these things. I mean, they're beautiful flowers, but I didn't grow them for that. I grew them as cover crop. I grew them to be cut down, but it's really hard to actually do that and make the cut. So when you're terminating buckwheat, the easiest way to terminate it is probably by mowing. In this type of a space where we've got the trellises and things like that, it would probably be easiest for me to just weed whack it. However, I have some little vines and flowers and things interspersed throughout, and it's not that large of a space, so I'm going to be terminating my buckwheat by hand. Yes, I know that's insane. I'm going to do it anyway. You can tell that it is time to terminate this buckwheat by the fact that almost all of it, if not all of it, is already flowering. That's what we want, but it's not yet setting seed, and I do not want it to go to seed, so that means the time is now. If it goes to seed, then it runs the risk of becoming another weed, and part of the reason for planting the buckwheat in the first place is to combat the weeds. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut it all down right at the base of the soil. I want to leave the roots in the soil to decompose and feed the soil life, and I'm going to lay the residue of the cover crop, so basically just what grew, directly on top of the soil. That is going to act as a green manure. It's going to fertilize as it breaks down, and kind of maybe a little bit of a weed barrier. I don't know how densely it will be, especially because in some areas the soil is just so poor and so compacted back here that it didn't grow very much, which is kind of the problem that I've been having with my crops in the first place, which is the reason for needing to cover crop in the first place. So I'm going to cut it all down at the base, and I'm going to actually plant my cover crop seeds for fall directly into the residue, and probably in a couple weeks from now.
So here I am just cutting everything down at the base with my hand clippers. I chose a buckwheat cover crop originally because I was planting in 100-degree weather. I needed something that was going to grow in the summer, and I wanted something that was going to get to maturity really quickly so that I could get another round of cover crop in here in the fall. So I wanted a summer cover crop to follow by a fall cover crop, and buckwheat was just the thing. It worked beautifully.
The other thing that's really great about cutting it all down by hand, aside from being able to preserve those vining plants that I did plant there, is that I was able to see and preserve. I have some volunteer dill, some volunteer kale, and just some other plants, and I'm also able to weed as I go. I've been battling this vicious bindweed in my garden since I planted it here. It was a no-dig garden, and I thought, oh, I'm not going to have to deal with weeds. That has been false. There is no way in gardening not to deal with weeds. So I am learning to accept that. But I was reading that this bindweed that I have can actually reduce your crop yields by up to 50%. I never in a million years would have thought the number would be that high. So, I mean, it kind of explains what I've been seeing in this area. So I am glad that I'm doing the cover crop, and I'm constantly weeding the bindweed. It's like a hydra, you know, you pull it out and more heads appear. There's just nothing that I have seen that really works. I did read one study that if you plant a summer cover crop of Sudan grass combined with the buckwheat, that actually killed 100% of the bindweed. So if it gets to be so bad that I am willing to sacrifice an entire gardening season again in this back garden, then that will be my plan. But for now, things will grow, and I can't see sacrificing another summer season. Maybe, we'll see. Poor little bee, still trying to pollinate what's left on this buckwheat mulch. It does make a pretty mulch, I'll give it that.
So as I was cutting this all down, I just kept thinking what a shame it was to be cutting down such beautiful flowers, even though I, as the gardener, knew that these were planted for a purpose and they were serving that purpose. It just really made me reflect on sometimes the Lord brings things into our lives that are there for a time and then He takes them away. And it was just a really tangible reassurance of, in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him. And Jesus tells us, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it can bear no fruit. In the spiritual life, in order for something greater to grow, something lesser has to die. And that's exactly the purpose of this buckwheat. It is dying so that more fruitful crops can grow and have life. And so for me, that was just a really beautiful moment out here. It's very meditative to be in the garden, just kind of listening to God speaking to my soul as I was doing this. On a more practical note, I also learned how incredibly important it is to have the right tool. I got such a callus on my hand from cutting with clippers that were old and worn out, wouldn't bounce back. And so finally, by the end of this project, I actually got some new clippers and they worked wonders. So I would say the message here, the lesson is just don't be afraid to move on from what you're used to, move on from what you've been using, and to use the right tool for the right job, because it was amazing to me how much faster and easier this job was after I had the right tool. Although I will say I wasn't used to them being so sharp, and I actually ended up cutting one of our irrigation lines and I had to do a fixed job right there in the spot because it sliced right through the plastic, which the other shears just never would have done. It would have taken so much muscle, which shows you how old and worn out those old ones really were. And so here's one of the best examples of those vining plants that are growing in the garden that I just wanted to get the cover crop cut down by hand so that I could keep those. In this portion of the garden is where the bindweed is worse. So as I was pulling up, cutting away the bindweed, I realized that I just needed to till up the entire garden bed to get at some of those roots, and I'll be doing that for the rest of the season just to battle it as much as possible. It is absolutely vicious. And the same thing over where the pumpkins are growing. When the bindweed is choking them out, I'm probably only gonna get like 4 pumpkins out of that area, which I'm happy to be getting any, honestly, but it does go to show how badly this one weed can affect those crops. But I can't remove it yet because I don't want to destroy those pumpkins. So to me, that's just a really tangible reminder of when Jesus talks about God the Father letting the weeds grow up with the wheat. And we may not always know why God allows a particular thorn or weed to grow up in our life. We can always have faith that it is for a purpose, for His good works that will be revealed in His time. So this is what the buckwheat looks like. And this vine is been able to grow a lot more since the buckwheat has been terminated. That's what the garden looks like now as the stuff is starting to yellow and break down. And you can actually see a couple, there's quite a few in this bed that I missed. So I have to come back and terminate those. Arugula and nasturtiums doing really well in here now. But you can tell that now that everything else has had a chance to die back a little bit. And I'm not that worried about it because honestly, these will winter kill in the frost anyway. But it is almost time to plant fall cover crop. So thanks for coming along with me as I terminate all this cover crop here in the back garden. And I hope you will stay tuned as we plant fall crops, plant the fall cover crop, and much, much more.